and poor people have another set. Any freedom that we're going to guarantee needs to be equally distributed to everybody. An important thing to understand is that you can't infinitely support the principle of freedom while also infinitely supporting the principle of equality, because they often come into conflict with each other, and then you have to figure out some sort of compromise between the two. So for example, if you take the principle of equality to mean that there should be equal outcomes everywhere, meaning all people working the same type of job should make the same amount of money, or maybe you think all types of people should be equally represented in every type of job. Liberals would say that the amount of interference it would take in people's lives to make those equal outcomes happen is tyrannical. So it would cost too much freedom and it's just not viable. But if you take the principle of equality to mean equality of opportunity, liberals are generally for that. But then even there's usually a cutoff point. So for example, let's consider the problem of parents wanting to provide for their kids. It's natural for parents to want to give their kids a leg up in life, whether it's hooking them up with a good job, maybe sending them to a good school, maybe giving them a bunch of money, whatever. In a perfectly free society, parents should be able to do as much of that as they want because it's their freedom to provide for their kids however they see fit. But then if their parents are propping their kids up to positions of power or giving their kids, millions of dollars, while other kids don't have that, then that's also compromising equality. So then a liberal would probably look at that and say, we need to find a healthy compromise here. We don't want to not allow this parent to provide for their kid because that's taking too much freedom from the parent. So let's find some sort of targeted policy here. Maybe when the parent wants to give an inheritance to the kid, we'll tax that inheritance. And then we'll take that money and we'll put it towards free education, therefore raising equality of opportunity in the rest of society. So that's just a way of saying you can't have a society that has full amounts of both. You can't have a perfectly free society and also a perfectly equal society. And liberals tried to find this sort of healthy balance between the two. So those were principles that were established at the time that were true of classical liberals and are still generally true of liberals now. In other ways, classical liberals were more distinct. So for example, they were pretty elitist. They didn't trust regular, uneducated people and wanted to keep voting to being a privilege. So they thought in order to earn the right to vote, you needed to get an education and also own property. So they did advocate that we should expand education to more people, but they thought until more people received it,
military action has remained intense and continuous. As in late 2020, as in winter, it feels from one crisis to the next. The war in Ukraine has continued with unabated intensity. The transition into winter has brought snows and plunging temperatures, but as in winters past, military action has remained intense and continuous. As in late 2022, Russia held the initiative after the culmination of a Ukrainian offensive, and appears to have decided to use that opening to do basically what they did last time, launching a series of offensive actions at multiple points along the front. The fighting that followed has varied from sustained ground battles around places like Avdiivka, through to the drone and missile attacks that exemplify the struggle for the Black Sea. Today, I want to give a broad update on some of those campaigns, asking what both sides have achieved, what we can observe about the fighting, and how well placed both sides are to continue their efforts through 2024. So to do that, I'll start with an overview of some of the recent fighting, looking at some of the major battlefields like Avdiivka, our estimates around visually confirmed losses, and a few observations around changing patterns in the fighting, as well as technical and tactical observations. Then I'll look at two other campaigns, the naval effort in the Black Sea, and what we've seen from the broad air war, Russian missile campaign, and Ukrainian drone strikes. Finally, as I often do, I'll pivot to asking some questions about long-term sustainability, including some of the knowns and unknowns around future Western support for Ukraine this year and beyond. Okay, so I'll start with a quick overview of where some of the serious fighting is taking place in Ukraine right now, and how the Russian winter offensive has developed since we last talked about it. I want to stress I won't be dwelling too much on the fine detail here, both because there are plenty of sources that cover those finer day-to-day movements, and also because if we want to get to some wider observations about the war as a whole, what we really need here is the big picture. As a quick refresher, in our last episode on this topic in 2023, we observed that with the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporizhia petering out, the initiative and choice of next move had broadly passed to Moscow. In a sense, the circumstances had some parallels to the end of 2022. At that point, Russia had mobilised and somewhat stabilised the front after a Ukrainian offensive. They presumably had a choice between focusing on regeneration or going on the attack, and chose the latter. The 22-23 winter offensive did take some territory, but it also expended tremendous amounts of Russian material and offensive potential, a decision which, all else being equal, probably weakened the Russian position in 2023 more broadly. So, a year later, in the closing stages of 2023, after the culmination of another Ukrainian offensive, the Russian military apparently opted to just do what it had done last time, one presumes, expecting a different result. Understanding the why of that decision probably comes back to understanding stated Russian objectives. We often talk about how much internationally recognised Ukrainian territory is currently under Russian occupation. But it's important to remember that as far as Russian law and stated war aims are concerned, there's still a huge amount of what they claim to be Russian territory under Ukrainian control. As far as the vast majority of the world, including countries like China, are concerned, Putin cannot in fact draw a line on the map, put on his best Star Sidious impression and then declare that he will make it legal. But as far as the Russian system is concerned, those lines are law. To control all the territory it claims to have annexed, Russia would have to recross the Dnipro, take Kherson, take Zaporizhia and its region, and, of course, the entire Donbass. And given that, as recently as 20 December last year, Putin came out and said that the special military operation will absolutely achieve all of its set goals, you can understand how much pressure there might be on the Russian military establishment to push forward towards those territorial objectives. So far, though, their offensive hasn't really gotten them closer. Instead, while the fighting has generally been very costly and stressed forces on both sides, significant Russian offensive efforts at multiple points along the front line have only resulted in very incremental territorial changes. What you can see on screen there, for example, are the results of almost 2 months of heavy fighting, with the 1st of December on the left and 23rd of January on the right. At a zoomed out level, the winter fighting has very much been a matter of meters, months, and munitions. And a quick look at some of the key battlefields should probably give you a sense of the broader endeavour. At Avdiivka, a city which has basically been on the front line since 2014, Russian offensive actions really started to scale up in October, and while attacks have waxed and waned, the offensive is still very much ongoing as I record this. When we last talked about the battle, a lot of the focus had been on the Russian efforts towards the north of the town, where they had successfully seized a giant waste pile, but had been unsuccessful into moving into the industrial area just slightly further south. You probably also remember that at the time there was plenty of coverage saying that Avdiivka would fall any day now. Suffice to say, it hasn't. Over the last nearly 3 months of fighting, the industrial areas of Avdiivka have generally held. Instead, the Russians have turned to largely incremental advances in a number of areas, moving further northwest along the railroad, turning the village of Stepove into an apparent grey zone arena, where the recent duel between those two Bradleys and a T-90M took place like something out of Solaris 7, while in the south and southeast, with the broader efforts to encircle Avdiivka so far failing, the Russians have started staging incremental advances into the city's residential areas. What you see here is some imagery, courtesy of the team at Front Intelligence Insight, that may help illustrate part of how those incremental advances are achieved. Defensible positions are flattened by artillery, larger defensible structures are demolished by air-delivered bombs, and eventually the defensive position can be degraded enough that the attackers might be able to move forward. This sort of approach is very slow and materially intensive, but if enough force is consistently applied, it can work. Overall, the situation for Ukrainians in
Wow, that was a mighty big word. You can claim to know what love is.
Das ist der Selbstmord! Wir sind verloren! Vorwärts, Soldat! Feuer eingestellt! Raus hier! Unter Granate! In die Deckung! Take cover! Requesting covering fire! Granate! Truppe weiter!
I do it over and over again. That's my life, over and 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 over.
Okay, Clay, I get the point.
No, you. That you love. And the only true justice was to let those dominant jackals feed on you, survive off you.
In Avdiivka actively defending it, probably very difficult. Reportedly, the Ukrainian artillery is not receiving the shells it needs to fight at its most effective, and for various reasons there are only so many reinforcements available. But for now, overall, Avdiivka is still holding. And as we'll see a little later in the loss statistics, applying this sort of pressure to Avdiivka appears to have cost the Russian forces dearly. Further to the north is Bakhmut, and for much of the war this place had become synonymous with slow, miserable, trench-based positional fighting. And so far over the winter, Bakhmut has remained true to form, consuming combat power and offensive potential for very little movement. The line that had been pushing towards Yahidne has been straightened out, while the villages of Klishivka and Andriivka are still assessed as being in Ukrainian hands, although frankly there's not much of them left. Similarly, in Marinka, which was already basically flattened a year ago, months spent have translated into metres or blocks gained. A wider or more successful push in the area by the Russians might raise some concerns for the Ukrainians, but at the same time the way the fighting here has progressed might give us some clues as to things to come. The ruins of Marinka were eventually taken, but when taking an objective like this requires months or even years of effort in this case, there's probably going to be plenty of time for an opponent to prepare new defensive positions, one or two terrain features back. And so the fall of Marinka, as we saw with Robotne and Bakhmut, hasn't so far led to some fast-moving deep breakthrough. Instead, the fighting has just lurched forward to the next trench, the next tree line, or the next town. Looking up at Kharkiv, you're again seeing basically positional advances, with the Russians still being a long, long way from being able to anchor a front along the Oskil River, which is where they had originally tried to stabilise during the Kharkiv counteroffensive. In the interest of time, I probably can't pay the fighting here or in any of these fronts their entire due, but it's important to understand that even in the cases where those lines don't move, the reason they have stayed static is often not due to a lack of activity, but rather the result of some often very heavy fighting. More difficult from an analytics perspective has been the fighting around Krinky. This is the tiny Ukrainian bridgehead across the Dnipro River that we've talked about before. And while over the last few months the Russians have been able to squeeze and shrink at the bridgehead, they haven't been able to eliminate it. And the result has been a battle that defies easy classification. For the Ukrainian Marines fighting on the left bank of the Dnipro, this battle is probably peak misery. The difficulty in getting heavy equipment across the river means those Marines will almost always be heavily outnumbered and usually operating with small arms and minimal supplies. But the Russian forces on the left bank are probably in a worse logistical position than the Ukrainians on the right. And as we'll see in a moment, numerous failed Russian mechanized attacks to try and eliminate that bridgehead have fallen victim to things like Ukrainian artillery and drones, resulting in significant, visually confirmed equipment losses. And for a while now, that appears to have been the steady state the battle has settled into. The Russians can't completely and permanently evict the Ukrainian bridgeheads, and have taken very significant losses every time they try, but the outnumbered and outgunned Ukrainian Marines in the bridgehead have no real prospect of breaking out. For Ukraine, the battle probably ties down significant Russian forces, drives the allocation of Russian aerospace forces, which have been used very heavily in the region, and allows them to engage in an area where broadly their logistics network is up to the challenge. But it's probably doing so at great cost and uncertainty for the small units holding that bridgehead on the other side of the Dnipro. The overall picture, however, is that while it's still very much ongoing, the Russian offensive hasn't really gone anywhere. There is still a major threat to Avdiivka's supply lines and a number of other locations. But for the most part, the results have been very, very positional. And while Ukraine's gains in Zaporizhzhia were likewise very positional, I'd argue there might be a distinction here. Because theoretically, Ukraine didn't have to go that far to have a major strategic impact. If Tokmak could be taken, the rail link to the west severed, and then some tragic accident befell the Crimean Bridge, then a 20-kilometre advance might have had implications for vast areas of occupied territory. The Russians presumably understood that, which helps explain the massive prepared defences. But in Russia's case, there's no real equivalent jugular to aim at. There might be places they could take which might require other withdrawals along the front, but for the most part, taking a position probably just means preparing to take the next one. And so while Ukraine is obviously still a long way away from its objective of throwing Russian forces out of their country, Russia is likewise still a very long way away from achieving theirs. And if the goal of this offensive has been to get Russia materially closer to those target borders, then it has dramatically failed to do so, at least so far. However, I'd argue that just because the fighting is often a matter of metres, that doesn't mean either that the war is locked in a perpetual stalemate, or that the armies aren't consuming a prodigious amount of equipment and ammunition fighting for those metres. Obviously, material consumption isn't the only factor in how the war is going or will continue to go. The importance of factors like casualties, politics, and economics all has to be acknowledged. But at the same time, things like equipment and ammunition availability have obviously been key inputs to the ability of both sides to fight. Infantry supported by IFVs and tanks are going to perform better than infantry fighting alone. A force trying to breach a minefield is going to need breaching equipment.
Position.
Gentlemen! Steady, lads!
Neue Position erreicht. In Position. Befehl ausgeführt. In Position. Befehl ausgeführt. Neue Position erreicht.
Feldwebel! Steady, lads! Hit the door!
Stellung bleiben!
Neue Position erreicht.
Vernichtet!
Befehl ausgeführt.
Feldwebel! Wir ergeben uns!
Neue Position erreicht. Befehl ausgeführt. Neue Position erreicht. Neue Position erreicht. In Position. Befehl ausgeführt. Zielpunkt nicht erreichbar.
Nicht schießen!
Unsere Leute geraten in Panik. In Position. Wir sind unter Beschuss.
Steady, lads!
En posición.
Steht in Deckung!
Lost connection!